Picture this, if you dare. You're sitting at home minding your own business when suddenly flames erupt from your body. There seems to be no cause of the fire, just you burning alive from the inside out. Sounds impossible, right? But for centuries, real people appear to have suffered this exact fate. Is it a freak accident, a strange scientific anomaly, or could there be something even more sinister or even paranormal at play? Well, I'm about to take you through some of the creepiest true-life cases where people, just like you and I, were consumed by an inexplicable inferno. I'm Peter Laws, and tonight I will take you not only into the fog, but the flames, because this is the fire within. Terrifying true cases of spontaneous human combustion. If you're enjoying Into the Fog and you want more from me, perhaps you'd like to check out my Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Peter Laws for a bunch of extras and a connection with me. And the support directly goes into making this channel better. Thank you. When I was a kid, first reading about the paranormal, I always remember a particularly scary topic that would crop up in magazines or books over and over again. And they would come with chilling photographs of the aftermath of a shocking fire that somehow only burned the person and not the surrounding area. Sometimes you'd even see photographs of a remaining limb, like a foot, looking perfectly intact, resting amongst the ashes. It was always a shocking yet popular topic to explore in paranormal media, though interestingly, I barely see it discussed these days. I'm quite surprised at that because spontaneous human combustion, when you think about it, is a truly frightening phenomenon. It's not officially recognized by most, and yet there are a plethora of apparent cases. They typically feature the grim discovery of human remains, quite often with the body all but incinerated, and yet curiously, everything else around the body remains untouched. Now, science would suggest to us that if a human body was burning to such a degree that it is practically reduced to ash, that a raging fire would spread, and rapidly too, and yet that doesn't seem to happen. Cases of spontaneous human combustion have been documented for years, with some even dating back centuries. And some remarkable statistics have been noted during this time. For example, 60% of all known cases involve women, while 50% seem to take place between midnight and 6 a.m. Another interesting detail was highlighted during research in the 19th century when it was noted that there could well be a connection between alcohol consumption, perhaps even alcoholism, and spontaneous human combustion. Well, let me take you through some of the examples of these cases, and I may warn you, some of these cases may well disturb you. Perhaps one of the earliest cases on record dates back to the mid-17th century and can be found in the writings of Thomas Bartholin. He was a Danish physician and mathematician who documented an incident in Latin in 1654. This was while he was in Milan in Italy. Now, some have argued that his notes were poorly translated and so it's difficult to rely on them. And yet, as you hear this story, and later keep it in mind, you will realize there are a lot of fascinating and disturbing similarities to the later cases. He spoke of a knight who was in the service of Bona Sforza. She was a queen of Poland in the 1500s. And this knight was partaking in a feast one evening while draining glass after glass of brandy. At one point during the festivities, after downing one more drink, the knight took his place at the table. But just then, he felt the burn of the amber liquid as it made its way down to his stomach. You know that feeling of if you have a shot of whiskey, for example, you feel the burn going down? Well, a moment later, he felt the burn coming back up. And then he suddenly had this sensation of heat rising through his throat. Maybe he thought he was about to vomit. But then he opened his mouth, and as opposed to brandy coming out, a flame burst forth from between his lips. And the fire suddenly engulfed him right in front of the guests at the party. They all looked on, horrified. Around 3/4 of a century later, in 1725, we started to see better documented cases. This one happened in France when a woman called Nicole Miller was found dead. You see, her incinerated remains were discovered sitting in a chair at home. But despite the extensive damage to Nicole, the chair itself was largely undamaged. Shortly after this grim discovery, Nicole's husband was accused of murder and was arrested. The authorities assumed that he had killed his wife elsewhere, burnt her body, and then for some weird reason had positioned that burned corpse into a chair, which would explain why the chair was undamaged. And being guilty of such a heinous murder in 1725 would have almost certainly meant execution at the guillotine. Had it not been for a surgeon, His name was Nicholas Lucas, and he took an interest in the case and ultimately spoke at the trial. It was suggested by Lucas that Nicole Miller had not been murdered at all. She had seemingly fallen victim to, quote, the phenomenon known as spontaneous human combustion. The court found in the husband's favor, and it was ruled that his wife had died by a visitation of God. 6 years later, another case came to light in Verona in Italy. It happened on the evening of April 3rd, 1731, when Countess Bandi Cesante enjoyed her usual routine of eating her evening meal before retiring to bed for the evening. Once she was in bed, her maid spoke with her for several hours before leaving her to sleep. She later recalled that there was nothing out of the ordinary about Cesante, other than she did mention she felt a little dull and heavy. The following morning, however, the maid noticed that the Countess hadn't called her in, as she usually did, and so she decided to go and wake her mistress, assuming she might feel unwell still. However, when she stepped into the room, she was confronted with a sight that was simply impossible to believe. It was shocking. According to the official report, it said this: 4 feet distance from the bed, there was a heap of ashes, 2 legs untouched, from the foot to the knee, with their stockings on. Between them was the lady's head, whose brains, half of the back part of her skull, and the whole chin were burnt to ashes, among which was found 3 fingers blackened. Despite the almost complete immolation of the Countess, the rest of the room remained undamaged by the fire. There was soot that had fallen across the room, and the windows had this weird yellowish goo trickling down them. Investigators looked for signs of what would have caused this freak blaze. They discovered 2 candles sat on their holders, but each was new and unlit. They found an oil lamp, thinking that must be the cause, but it contained no oil. The only clue they found was that the bed sheets had been turned down in a manner that appeared someone had, fallen asleep in bed and then had left at some point in the night, fully expecting to return shortly after. Some of the best minds in Italy were tasked with solving the mystery, and a later report found that no conventional catalyst like the oil lamp or the candles had played a part in her death. They started to wonder, could the Countess have gotten out of bed in the middle of the night, maybe to get a drink of water or to open a window, and was somehow struck by silent lightning that had, quote, crept in through a crack in the window or down the fireplace before making contact with the Countess. And yet the characteristic signs of lightning strikes, like scorch marks on the walls or an acrid smell, were not present. She did have a habit of bathing in wine, which could well have caused the fire, yet others wondered what had sparked that fire. One of them was a man investigating this, a priest, and he strongly believed that the fire had come from inside the Countess, and that her entrails with their gases and combustible liquids had somehow sparked within her and set her ablaze. Charles Dickens, the famous English author, mentions this case in the preface for the 1853 printing of his novel Bleak House. A character in the book dies due to spontaneous human combustion, and so Dickens included this case of the Countess to show that he believed this phenomenon was real. Indeed, Dickens apparently had read everything he could on the subject. Another eerie case unfolded in the USA, and it happened in Seneca, which at the time was a small farming community in Illinois. It was Christmas Eve in 1885 when Matilda Rooney was at home with her husband Patrick. She was in the kitchen while Patrick was sat in the neighboring room. We know this because that's where their bodies were found. They were discovered the following day. Matilda had seemingly burst into flames in the kitchen and was reduced to nothing more than a pile of ash, while Patrick was found dead in the chair in the next room. Apparently, he had been suffocated by the fumes of his wife's burning body. Despite this horrific blaze, there was no other damage to the property. It was as if Matilda's body had been consumed by the flames and then simply had died out. And yet there were no signs whatsoever of where the fire had come from. It was almost as if Matilda herself was the source of the flames. With such mysterious circumstances and a lack of evidence, and indeed no signs of foul play, the case was all but seen to be unsolvable. The authorities did eventually track down one of the farm workers who had spent several hours with the couple on the night in question, and he insisted that everything was normal during his visit, and that when he left, the Rooneys were preparing to enjoy a glass of whiskey and to begin celebrating Christmas. There was absolutely no sign whatsoever of what was to become of them. As the 20th century unfolded, particularly the second half, more and more cases of spontaneous human combustion began to get documented. And they are frightening. This next case happened just after 9 p.m. on December 4th, 1966. A 92-year-old retired physician called Dr. John Irving Bentley seemingly became engulfed in a mysterious and sudden ball of flames while in his bathroom. His remains were discovered the following morning, when a man called Don Gosnell let himself into the property. He was there to read Bentley's meters. As he was making his way to the basement, he noticed a bizarre blue type of smoke which was hanging thickly in the air, as well as an unusual smell that he described as sickly sweet. It was then that he noticed a pile of ash near the basement door. And when he looked up, he saw a hole in the ceiling, which led to Bentley's bathroom. He hurried upstairs to check what had happened and perhaps wished he hadn't. He was horrified by what he saw. As well as a large pile of ash, there was a human foot and an ankle, still wearing an undamaged slipper on the bathroom floor. The foot was all that remained of John Bentley. Next to the remains was the former doctor's walking frame, which was largely undamaged too. It appeared that Bentley had remained rooted to the spot while he burned, causing a small hole in the floor that allowed ash to eventually drop to the room below. Was there a natural reason for this, or was this another case of spontaneous human combustion? One of the most detailed cases occurred in Lambeth, South London. And what's more, this actual fire was witnessed by others as it happened. It was the morning of September 13th, 1967, and it was around 5 a.m. when several early morning commuters were on their way to work. They noticed a bright light coming from a derelict house on 49 Auckland Street. Upon looking into the property, they witnessed a local man and a known alcoholic called Robert Bailey lying on the ground with a bizarre blue flame coming out of his torso. One of the onlookers immediately notified authorities, and by 5:19 a.m., firefighters from Lambeth Fire Brigade were on the scene. One of those in attendance was a fireman. His name was John Stacey, and he stated in his report that, quote, "When we entered the building, he, Bailey, was lying on the bottom of the stairs, half turned onto his left side, and his knees were drawn up as though he was trying to bend the pain from his stomach. And there was about a 4-inch slit in his stomach, and the flame was emanating from that, like a blowtorch. It was a blue flame." He would further state that this flame was coming from inside the body itself, and that Bailey was literally burning from the inside out. When you consider that the commuters saw the glow from Bailey at about 5 a.m. and the firefighters still saw the flame shooting out of his body at 5:19, it appears that this flame was coming out of him for almost 20 minutes. Despite the fire crew's best efforts to extinguish the flames, Bailey was declared dead at the scene, unsurprisingly. Even more harrowing are the details of Bailey's final positioning. Before he succumbed to the flames, he was lying near a mahogany staircase, and he had bitten into the bottom step with such force, as a demonstration of the sheer pain he must have been in, with such force that his jaw had to be forced open just so the body could be removed. The subsequent investigation into Bailey's harrowing death only made the case more complex and confusing. Despite the flames being clearly seen from Bailey's torso, the rest of his clothing suffered no damage whatsoever. Furthermore, despite most of the furnishings around him, including the stairs, being made of wood, they also were undamaged. Even more perplexing, there were no signs of the source of this fire. Even the gas and electricity supply had been cut off from this derelict house several months earlier. Initially, Bailey's death was ruled as being due to asphyxia due to fume inhalation. However, this was quickly revised to an official ruling of, quote, unknown causes. Another eerie case took place in London 15 years later. It was September 1982, and on the afternoon in question, 61-year-old Jean Saffin was sitting at the table with her father. Now, Jean was mentally disabled and lived with her parents. Suddenly, during the meal, Jean's father noticed a strange, quote, flash of light in his peripheral vision, and by the time he had turned his attention to Jean, she was completely engulfed in flames. Even stranger, listen to this. He said she simply sat there calmly as the fire engulfed her body. Her father did his best to douse the flames with water. He even physically dragged her to the sink. He called out to his son, who rushed in to help, and between them they eventually put out this raging inferno. Despite emergency services arriving shortly after and taking Jean to hospital, she fell into a coma and sadly passed away 8 days later. The investigation that followed would unveil some disturbing details. Jean's brother-in-law, Donald Carroll, stated, "Flames were coming out of her mouth like a dragon. And what's more, these flames were making a roaring noise." The family insisted that Jean was a victim of spontaneous human combustion. The coroner, however, refused to record such a verdict because he simply said, "There is no such thing." Was he right to stick to the established narrative on these cases? Or was he just in denial of an unexplainable, shocking event? The calmness of Jean as she burned is fascinating, as well as horrible. And it reminds me of another disturbing case that happened 7 years earlier in Georgia, in the United States. Only this time, the victim would survive. One evening in 1974, a traveling salesman called Jack Angel parked up outside a hotel and prepared to spend the night in his motorhome. Several hours later, he awoke in great pain. He discovered that he had severe burns to his arm and torso, with one of his arms being so badly damaged that it eventually had to be amputated. Yet there was no other damage to Angel's motorhome. Even stranger, he had no memories of the fire. He just remembered waking up to find himself in severe pain. Was he asleep or in some kind of calm, strange trance throughout the encounter? Only coming around when the flames had died down. Indeed, given the extent of his injuries, Angel should have been completely incinerated. Yet no apparent source of the flames were discovered. There were no signs of any faults with the electrics of the motorhome either. The case remains a mystery. A disturbing case occurred in Sydney, Australia on the afternoon of August 24, 1998. Agnes Phillips was picked up from the nursing home where she lived. She was picked up by her daughter, Jackie Park. Agnes suffered from Alzheimer's, and Jackie would often drive her around the countryside so her mother could enjoy the outdoors for several hours. By the time they were on their way back to the nursing home, Agnes had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. And so Jackie decided to stop the car at a local store just to pick up a few groceries, and she left her mother asleep in the car. While she was still in the store, Jackie noticed smoke rising into the air outside. When she looked out of the store window, she could clearly see the smoke was rising from her car. A moment later, an explosion of flames burst from the parked vehicle. By the time Jackie had run from the store, a passerby was dragging her mother from the car and smothering the flames that were attempting to engulf her body. And to Jackie's astonishment, throughout all of this, her mother remained completely calm, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The only words she would utter was that it was too hot. Although she was taken to hospital, she passed away a week later. An inquest was unable to reveal any source of the fire, and furthermore, the car engine was switched off at the time, so an electrical fault was highly unlikely. The death was ruled as an open verdict. As the opening decades of the 2000s have unfolded, potential cases of spontaneous human combustion have continued to be reported. One of the most unusual took place in Brazil on the evening of December 16, 2007. According to an account, an unnamed woman suddenly burst into flames in front of a crowd of onlookers and was, quote, incinerated within seconds. Although most of her body was engulfed in flames, her lower right leg remained undamaged. One investigator stated that it appeared that she had been burnt from the inside out. Some wondered if she had been hit by ball lightning, while other theories even asserted that the woman's death was the result of some kind of gang initiation. However, despite such suggestions, the mystery woman's death remains unexplained. 3 years later, on December 22, 2010, in the West Galway region of Ireland, another incident took place. And of particular interest here was the fact that it was the first time in a quarter of a century that a person's death was officially recorded as being due to spontaneous human combustion. The body of 76-year-old Michael Faherty was discovered, or more to the point, what was left of it, because he seemed to have been killed in some sort of fire. When investigators entered Faherty's home, they were at a complete loss as to what had happened. it was clear that the nearby fireplace was not the cause of the blaze, and they couldn't find any other source either. Fortean was discovered lying on his back with his head facing toward the fireplace, and the only damage other than the body was to the floor and the ceiling directly above him. The rest of the room untouched by the blaze. As part of his verdict, the coroner, Dr. Kieran McLaughlin, referred to the writings of Professor Bernard Knight. This professor had noted that many people suspected of being victims of spontaneous human combustion were often found close to an open fireplace, exactly as Fortean had been found. He concluded, "This fire was thoroughly investigated, and I'm left with the conclusion that this fits into the category of spontaneous human combustion, for which there is no adequate explanation." It's also worth detailing an incident that occurred a little over a year later, in December 2016, in a small town in Serbia called Novi Sad. According to reports on several media platforms, video surfaced showing a man lying asleep in a doorway, most likely intoxicated. But he had strange white flames emerging from his torso, and within a matter of seconds, the man's body was almost engulfed in flames, although he himself appears calm and either unaware or unconcerned by the events. There were many claims put forward online about this footage, saying that, this was a case of spontaneous human combustion, while others said, no, this video footage was nothing but a hoax, and you can understand why people would think that. And yet we might think twice when we bear that video in mind, along with some of the cases we've explored this evening. Ultimately, for all the research that's been done on documented cases and the intricate studies, spontaneous human combustion remains as much of a mystery now as it has ever been. Can all of these cases really be put down to carelessness or some kind of freak accident with a flammable substance that has somehow been overlooked by others? Might the explanation reside in some area of science that is currently unknown to us? Could it be connected to the not fully understood and complex interaction of body fats and their flammability with static and internal electricity within the human body? Does alcohol play a part, as many of the cases seem to involve it? Or could it be that this phenomena has a more supernatural explanation? Some suggest that these are examples of divine retribution or punishment. The idea of God striking someone down seems rather like a cliche, but there are some who wonder if the cases we have looked at tonight are precisely that. Remember how in the earlier cases, this was described as a visitation from God. With this theory on deck, we might also contemplate this phenomena where someone enters a kind of trance during the process. We've seen numerous cases where the victims seemingly remain calm while flames begin to incinerate them. Furthermore, even in cases where the remains are discovered after the fact, there's no evidence that the respective individual runs around wildly in an attempt to douse the flames, which you thought would have happened, but rather they appear to have simply remained calmly in one place. Is this some kind of strange mercy from a god that destroys someone but spares them the pain of it? Well, who knows? But there are plenty of other paranormal theories about this topic. What about ghosts or poltergeists? The idea of spontaneous fires erupting are surprisingly common in haunting cases. Usually they involve mysterious scorch marks on a wall or some other part of the house. Could it be that such entities have the ability to set fires inside people? Might these incidents be the result of a run-in with a demonic entity or even the devil himself? I even read a disturbing theory that suggested people who burst into flames spontaneously may have been previously possessed by a demon, but then the demon leaves the body and sets fire to the host. Like a criminal might steal someone's car, then burn it out later. That happened to one of our cars when I was a kid. Someone stole our car, used it in a robbery, and then it was discovered burned out. Those with deep religious beliefs may wonder if this theory would explain the strange circumstances of spontaneous human combustion. Then, of course, there is the idea of pyrokinesis, which is the alleged ability to be able to psychically create and control fire with the mind, seen most famously in the book and film by Stephen King, Firestarter. Could these people be the unfortunate victims of a psychic murderer? There are some theories on this topic that are born out of Eastern spiritual traditions. Some believing that this spontaneous human combustion is caused by the uncontrolled rise of Kundalini energy. Kundalini is said to be a powerful energy that collects at the base of the spine, and if the energy is misaligned or somehow used too quickly, the suggestion is that it might cause some power surge leading to combustion. Others have suggested that these incidents could be linked to the opening and closing of invisible electrical energy fields, essentially portals or interdimensional gateways, even ley lines or energy vortexes. Could these be responsible for the spontaneous human combustion, where we find people just end up in the wrong place at the wrong time? Could this even be some sort of alien abduction gone wrong? Of course, all of these theories are highly speculative, which simply reflect on how little this topic is understood. Yet, as we've heard tonight, these are not tales from a storybook. These have been seen in multiple real-life cases, sometimes by witnesses, that have left investigators scratching their heads. But along with the mystery and confusion comes the fear. Perhaps the most harrowing thought about spontaneous human combustion is to simply ask, can this happen to any one of us at any time? And very likely without warning. Maybe that alone should prompt us to try and get to the bottom of this fire mystery. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to The Fire Within, terrifying true cases of spontaneous human combustion. Good night.